Jeff's frozen.
All right. Can you hear me now? All right. Okay, we'll start over again. Hi, friends. Welcome. My name is Jeff Hunt. I have the wonderful privilege of serving as the Vice President of Public Policy for Colorado Christian University, where I help direct our university's think tank, the Centennial Institute. I'm traveling today, hence the complications putting us all together, but we're in Washington, D.C. filming for an upcoming movie we're going to do on the role of the Bible and the founding of America and how critical the Bible is to shaping our nation. And but we have critical issues to discuss, and that's the point of today. Today we're going to be discussing the new kind of police reform legislation that came out of the legislature just these past few weeks. Following the death of George Floyd, the Colorado legislature passed a bipartisan bill reforming Colorado's policing. How does this bill improve or harm Colorado policing? Is Colorado facing a systemic racist policing problem? What are the positive and negative effects Black Lives Matter is having on policing in America? Why is Denver seeing a spike in violent crime recently? And are police doing enough to stop the destructive protests happening in Denver? Well, I'm so very grateful to have joining us today George Brauchler, the DA for the 18th Judicial District, and Patrick Neville, the House Minority Leader here in Colorado, who was part of the discussions when this bill went through. And we're going to kind of dive into these issues. And as we're discussing, I want you all to be commenting on YouTube and Facebook where we're broadcasting today, and I'll be relaying those questions back to our panelists. So make sure you're commenting there and engaging, and we'll be sure to share and dive into those questions. But gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Great. So we'll start with you, House Minority Leader Patrick Neville. You were part of the discussions on this bill, and Colorado was really kind of early on in looking at kind of some of the police reform issues that needed to take place. Can you give us kind of a insider's take as to what happened at the Colorado legislature and how this bill came to be?
Yeah, definitely. So when this bill first came about, I got to admit that I was incredibly worried for our whole police forces and our systems all throughout. When it was introduced, it came out introduced with every single Democrat as a co-sponsor on the bill. So they already had their 33, 18, and 1 ready to go. It came out introduced in, quite frankly, a horrible bill that would have been disastrous for our police forces throughout the state. Silly things like it didn't even apply to the state patrol, but only local police forces. The qualified immunity was just no limits to it whatsoever, and they didn't allow indemnification on that qualified immunity from the local government or even private insurance for that matter. It's absolutely a horrendous bill. When it came through the Senate, some good work through Senator John Cook, who's a former sheriff, as well as Bob Gardner. I would say that the Senate probably got them to do not a 180 on the bill, but probably a 90-degree turn. So it actually passed out of the Senate 32-1. There was only one dissenting vote on that. And then it came to the House, and I still wasn't prepared to support it in its current form. In the House, I would say we did some more work, and we added about another 75-degree turn to that 180, and it got it to a place where I thought it was a really tough vote for me still, but I would say 51% good in there, 49% bad. But one of those things that, it's one of those things, if you just sit in your spot and you just continue to rail against it, it's an important issue. It's hard to be a part of the discussions to solve it in the future if there are issues that arise from this bill. So different dynamic than usually for me, because typically I stake out my position early and sit there. But with a bill of this nature and the way it was introduced, definitely we took a different tact and got it to a position where I think it's mostly good, but there's still some work that needs to be done with it.
What was the real kind of issue driving this bill? We definitely see bad policing in certain areas, but is there a sense that policing was this bad in Colorado that it needed to be addressed so urgently with this bill?
Well, so the Democrats have brought all sorts of bills year after year. And quite frankly, what I see is they're usually big city problems. By and far, most of the police forces out there are doing most of what's in this bill as passed. I mean, I take a look at my local police department, Castle Rock, and I think they're probably the best. They come out on top for me. They're examples for every police department. And when I talk to the chief there and some other officers, they think that this probably won't change a single thing of what they do. So I think there were some issues maybe with certain departments that they were trying to attack and make a kind of a statewide solution. But by and large, that's what we see. If there were any issues, it was usually in either Denver or Aurora, places like that.
So let's walk through kind of what the bill laid out and ultimately achieved. One of the big examples early on was, or one of the big aspects of the bill was getting body cameras on all the different police. Doesn't seem that controversial, but someone's got to pay for it. Did they talk about how they're going to pay for the body cameras?
So right, so they basically laid it out till 2023 that all these departments have to actually, if they don't have body cameras now, that they have to get them by until 2023. So it gives us some time to work for the funding. Like I said, for most of the departments, they're already doing this. Same with like Castle Rock, they've already got the body cameras. The bill as introduced had some major issues with body cameras because there was no protection for privacy of the normal citizen and how that video footage gets released. There were some major gaps for our district attorneys that could have given basically their ability to prosecute and move forward in investigations, some major hurdles to jump because of the way the language was. And so the DA's bar came forward with a lot of language on the body cameras and how that footage actually gets released from the bill as introduced that will stop a lot of it. So yeah, we do need to work on the funding because quite frankly, a lot of these small departments probably don't have the funding. But I know a lot of police officers that actually do enjoy the body cameras and like to use them because usually in a lot of circumstances, the body cameras prove that our police they're usually acting in good faith and doing the right thing. And so typically it's actually a justification for their actions.
Right, George, you work directly with law enforcement. I don't imagine that there was a lot of pushback on the body camera aspect of this bill. It gets them out of their own challenges when they're being accused falsely of things. What was the response from your perspective, George, on the body camera aspect of this?
Well, look, one, I'm a big fan of body cams. It's frustrating for me as a prosecutor when a law enforcement either doesn't have them, fails to activate them, or they malfunction or run out of battery life. Those things happen. That's frustrating because it makes it difficult to explain to juries, and it's harder for us to prove or disprove certain things that take place in a case. So I'm a big fan. We only had 2 agencies that were in the process of getting body cams anyway out of Arapahoe County. I think all the agencies in Douglas have them. So it wasn't a huge change. You're right about the cost, and the cost isn't like the body cams are the big cost. It's a lot like printers and toner, right? They'll sell you the printer for $100, but the toner is $1 trillion every 30 days. Same thing for the storage of these videos. One thing that they've done though, 2 things about the body cams that I find a bit troubling. One, the way they've defined interaction with the public. I worry that the expectation will be that booking officers have to wear body cams throughout the entire booking process and any other engagement that takes place in a jail because there is technically the use of force and certain techniques. I am not convinced at all that's what the bill was intended for. The bill was intended for those street contacts that you have to see what law enforcement's doing out there. The other thing that's going to take place is the number of hours of video that are going to have to be stored becomes Herculean. So for our little old jurisdiction, which is the biggest in the state, we only get the body cams on things that happen that turn into cases. And just because of the sheer advances in technology and the amount of space that has to be taken up in storage, I'd say we average close to $200,000 a year in extra storage that we need for all this video and some other digital things. I think we just within the last 3 years spent about $450,000 on an upgraded server. That's just us. That is not an agency who may have to hang on to these things for 60, 90 days or more. The other part that's troubling to me is, even though they made some changes, the mandate that the body cam be released to the public within 21 days on any case in which there's some allegation of police misconduct. That's it, mere allegation. Doesn't have to be founded or proven. It's got to be turned over. 21 days is a quick turnaround time. And even if there's an ongoing investigation, they've said they would only allow it to extend to 45 days. That's troubling because not every case gets solved in 45 days. And the concern that I have is one of the rules that governs what we do is to make sure that we don't put things into the public stream that could poison the well with a future juror against a would-be defendant. Whether that defendant is someone on the street or a police officer, doesn't matter. And so I worry about the fact that we're going to rush to dump all this information out with very little discretion and very little opportunity to say, hey, this one's an exception. There are no exceptions built in. And I just wonder what that's going to do to our ability to move forward with a prosecution, God forbid, if we have to go down that road with a police officer.
On that note, George, there's a lot of discussion on what this is going to do, and we can start to get into qualified immunity, which now allows, from what I understand, people to sue police officers in their personal capacity. There was good faith protections in there, but probably the most controversial aspect of this, I think, is going to be this notion of qualified immunity. And whether or not we're now going to open up police officers to a tremendous amount of lawsuits and them having to spend time defending themselves. Let's talk a little bit about first, George, what you think this is going to do to court cases and whether or not there's going to be an expansion there. And then, Patrick, I'd love to hear from you your support of the issue of qualified immunity and what that means. Did we lose George?
I think
so,
we did.
Patrick, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Patrick, let's start on this notion of qualified immunity.
right. So as the bill introduced, qualified immunity was way too broad and probably would have just done exactly like you were worried what you were saying would have done. And that's essentially allow them to sue anyone in their personal capacity with no limits whatsoever. For me, a big key of that was getting that good faith put in. So this is a standard that's basically higher than criminal law. So a police officer could be doing something criminal, but as long as there's reasonable belief for him to believe that that's not criminal, it still doesn't even apply to him to get sued in his personal capacity. So this really is like the highest standard that has to be reached. A good example that people were trying to say that this bill would lead to is a law enforcement officer's ordered to do something by his superior, does it, and then he gets sued. Well, I think any reasonable person, any reasonable jury or judge out there would say, if you are ordered by your superior, there's good belief and good faith and reasonable that what you're doing is legal and just. So it is the highest standard burden of proof that we have to get out there. And then even then, they're limited to 5% of the overall damages or $25,000 total. So essentially, the department has to indemnify them for anything above and beyond that, the actual local government. And I think that's probably a good thing too, because then the local government will actually, have a say in their actual training practices and what they do and make sure that they aren't violating people's civil rights. But above and beyond that, they indemnify them for the rest. Another big key factor in there too is that attorney's fees can be awarded. So if you have people bringing frivolous lawsuits, they're going to have to pay for the attorney fees of the defense of the officer in his personal capacity and the department in their public capacity. And so I think that's a good key that will probably also keep a lot of frivolous lawsuits coming out. But as I said, the bill introduced would have gone way too far and been way too broad on this for me. And I think they got it to a good place that I actually supported what was done.
There's an interesting divide within the conservative community on qualified immunity, because there are those of us, George, we got you double screen there. All right, bud.
That's pretty awesome. Hang on, man.
Two camera angles.
No, I'm back.
And either of you can talk about this. So there's those of us that want limited government, right? So we don't want overburdensome police. We don't want an over-militarized the limited government. But at the same time, we back the blue. We don't want to see them drug into constant lawsuits, reasons that people might not want to join the force. So how do you balance those issues with qualified immunity? And George, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me step back a bit on the qualified immunity thing. For folks that don't know, at the federal level, there is a Civil Rights Act that's been pretty powerful. It's called 1983, colloquially. And about 40 years ago, the Supreme Court and the appellate courts invented qualified immunity. It is not something that exists in statute. It's not something that Congress debated and decided. This was something that a court invented. And the early versions of it at the federal level were actually pretty good. But over time, it was turned into something it was never intended to be. And that was to create this prerequisite that there must be some clear prior existing case law that would say that whatever the officer did he's now being accused of doing, that was found to be illegal or a violation of someone's rights. And if you didn't have that precedent, the case got kicked out before you ever got into court. That bar is so high, nobody could ever really get there, okay? So when we talk about the state stepping in to undo qualified immunity, it's because this bill creates a state version of 1983, but in a much more narrow, just go after the cops kind of way. So now we've opened up our state courts to more lawsuits for civil rights violations against state officers. But if we were really going to mirror 1983, we'd open it up for all of state government to include the governor and the treasurer and the secretary. We didn't do that. This was an I hate cops approach to opening up this area of civil rights. Now, having said that, the reason they went ahead and did this and struck qualified immunity is because other states have done something similar where they've created a state cause of action for civil rights violations. And those appellate courts have said, well, if there's qualified immunity at the federal level for this, let's interpret it to exist here at the state. So they were very smart in being very proactive and saying, we just want to be clear, there's no qualified immunity. Patrick's right. The original version of this bill created a zero defect environment for cops where any mistake could result in $100,000 or some other drastic things coming out of their pocket. So this permits good faith mistakes. And I think, there's no other area or industry I'm aware of where we go zero defect, right? Like cops are no more prone to making mistakes than doctors. Doctors kill people all the time. Forgive me if you're a doctor out there, but this is why you carry malpractice insurance. And we don't say, hey, the first time that you end up with a bad result, you're no longer a doctor and you lose your house. We don't do that. So it was important that they made these changes. I think it's yet to be seen what this is going to do in the courts. I appreciate that there's attorney's fees for a frivolous lawsuit, but personally, I think that's fake because it requires the judge to make a determination that the lawsuit was frivolous, which is an incredibly high bar. You rarely ever see it in the civil law. So in essence, cops are going to have to fend off a lot more lawsuits. That is not going to come out of their pockets because my guess is 99% of those things are going to be bogus. And the cities and their insurance policies, or if they're self-insured, taxpayers are going to cover the cost of all this stuff. That's going to be a big deal. I think from the practical standpoint, you are now creating more hesitation in law enforcement. And I'm not talking about hesitation from an actor who might otherwise be reckless with their use of power. I don't want them out there recklessly using their authority. I'm talking about good cops who are trained to do the right thing at the right time, who don't have seconds to sit there and think, maybe I should try a different approach. That's not how these events unfold. Never, never. Maybe in a hostage situation. But we're now going to create hesitation in a group of people that we train and pray don't hesitate when it's a matter of life and death. And I'm not sure how that's going to show up on the street. I don't know how we're ever going to measure that in terms of quantification. I also think the fact that this happens and it's put out in the public this way, two things are going to happen. One of them I'm already seeing. Veteran cops, good cops who you want to be there for the tough situations and to help train the lower ranks. These folks are taking early retirement and they're popping smoke and leaving and saying, I'm all done here. There's no reason to keep going. I want to get out before this gets even uglier. And then on the front end, what good young woman or young man who's thinking, I'm willing to sacrifice the potential of a lot more money in the private sector because I want to serve my community in uniform. I want to do the right thing. I'm even willing to take on the risk of putting myself between evil and innocence. And then, oh, by the way, it turns out the state is passing laws that make me more and more unlikely to make that decision because I'm liable for all of these mistakes, and I am disrespected and I'm spit on. And people, you should watch some of these Facebook Live things, man, from the protest out at the Aurora Municipal Center at the end of last week. Disgusting, some of the things that happened. And so I think we're going to see an Atlas Shrugged moment in law enforcement. And you're going to see more and more good people leaving or refusing to come in. And it's going to have a spiral effect. We're going to have less good people training less good people. And man, I don't know what's going to happen in light of all the crime I think is coming for us. So,
okay, to take their approach and their side from the other side, we've got some bad cops, ones that are kneeling on the backs of people to the point that they die. So in some cases, they're trying to find a way to deal with the bad apples out there. But it sounds like they're creating scenarios where a lot of good people are going to walk away from the job as a result of it.
that's my sense. That's my sense of it. I also think that, and Patrick can speak to this better than I can, it feels like over the last 8 to 10 years, our legislature, especially with regard to criminal justice matters and public safety matters, tends to legislate about things that don't take place in Colorado. They legislate based on anecdotes that get a lot of publicity in other parts of the country. We have, in my opinion, some of the premier law enforcement agencies in the country. And when I say progressive, I mean lowercase p progressive, that do a lot of things that move past that 1950s, 60s version of law enforcement. They're all here. Are there bad apples in law enforcement? You betcha. Are they here in Colorado? Sure. Are they the exception to the rule? I have no doubt in my mind there's a handful of them that are driving this narrative and make this thing seem much more real and worse than it is. The problem is when you have a legislature that is driven by the Denver-Boulder corridor and they don't have a lot of respect or love for law enforcement based on whatever. I'm not telling you their feelings aren't legitimate. I'm saying the response to it isn't. And they make that statewide application to fix a problem they perceive to exist in Denver. That's not good for anyone outside of Denver.
Patrick, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I tend to agree that it's usually a couple bad apples. And part of the problem we actually have in policing is some of the police unions come in and they really do defend the bad apples, and the bad apples, the punishment that's put down on them gets taken away, or they get reinstated with full pay. So a lot of times, even the brass and that's trying to do the right thing is held back from doing the right thing. And that's what I was actually told. There are some provisions in this bill by some of the most respected sheriffs and chiefs that I know that I would put at the top of the top of the bracket on how they actually handle their police forces. But this actually makes it a little easier for them to put some administrative punishments, or even to completely fire someone who is acting in bad faith. And so I think that was a good step in the bill too, but that probably needs to be expanded and even worked on even more. There seems like there's so much of the conversation was totally stripping qualified immunity completely, which thank goodness we didn't do it in that manner, but we need to start talking about that other aspect too of, okay, when do the unions play a role and have a responsibility in how these bad actors have been able to continue to be bad actors because of the union's role in actually making sure that these guys aren't fired or don't have punishments when they have done something wrong.
I think there's also another aspect to this. Those unions show up in municipalities, right? Those are police chiefs that are emasculated from making decisions that make it through the day. Elected sheriffs have a great deal more flexibility and autonomy in the decision-making about getting rid of sheriff's deputies. It's another reason to be super supportive of your elected law enforcement versus someone who is a political appointee of some other body or town manager or something. The other aspect of this is, look, if we wanted to pass a law that, and I proposed this to Senator Fields and some of the other members of the Senate Judiciary, if we wanted to target the bad guys, one of the things we could do is to create a sentencing enhancer for people that commit crimes while actively engaged as law enforcement or in uniform. And the example is this: we punish people for hurting children. We punish people who hurt children who are in a position of trust with that child a lot more. We do the same thing at a bunch of different levels. It feels to me like law enforcement, they are in that position of trust. We tell people to give in to them. We tell people to do what they say. If you use that position of trust to harm someone, it seems to me we send a very powerful message by saying, if you do that, we promise you you're going to prison. Promise you you're going to prison. But I got to say, the legislature being in the hands that it's in right now, the idea of sending people to prison mandatorily, that's not a winner. That's not a winner.
Let's talk a little bit about use of force, bans on chokeholds, carotid control holds. Patrick, what did you hear from law enforcement down there about those? I've heard mixed messages. People have said, yeah, of course, we already banned these. We don't really practice them. When it comes to kneeling on someone's back until the breath's out of them, that's not a practice of law enforcement. Chokeholds are different, but we don't practice those either. I've heard other people, I was listening to Joe Rogan, who said, listen, that's just a move in UFC you use to till somebody gives in. What did you hear from law enforcement on chokeholds and carotid holds?
So this is not a new subject, kind of going back to what you were stating and George was talking about earlier, that when they try to legislate on issues that happen in different parts of the country. So when, there was that gentleman that was killed after a chokehold or died after a chokehold, they had passed a similar bill, or they brought it forward at least the first year in a really bad form. And that bill was actually defeated. And then they brought it back the next year too. And it was defeated only because we actually had a Republican Senate, mind you. It passed the House almost party line, and then the Senate defeated it. The next year they brought it back and got some input, and they actually stakeholdered with law enforcement, and they got it to a place where everyone was okay with it. And what this bill does is basically replicates some of that language which is already passed. And so that was one of the things that actually did happen in the House, one of the clarifying amendments that really needed to be put in the House that we were able to get done.
George, your perspective working with law enforcement on those bans?
Well, yeah, look, I even wrote a column on this. I reached out to all the major law enforcement agencies in our jurisdiction and some outside. So everywhere from, Justin Smith in Larimer County to Tony Spurlock in Douglas, Tyler Brown in Arapahoe, Aurora Police Chief. Really, Aurora was the only one that still allowed a much more, open environment for the use of it in appropriate circumstances. But everyone else had said, we don't train this as part of our law enforcement training. But do I want my guys to feel like they can use it if it's a life or death situation? Yes. I mean, we want these men and women to go home every night. And so I think that this thing addresses that. Great. Get rid of the chokehold. It really wasn't there to begin with, as Patrick said. But we still leave open the possibility. And again, you're going to have elected DAs weighing in on some of the decisions about whether or not this ought to be criminalized down the road anyway. I just think if someone ended up in a position where they'd have to use it, you'd know that, right? You'd get that from the facts. And that's a good place for us to be.
Failure to intervene was part of this. An officer who fails to try to another for using excessive force could face a Class 1 misdemeanor or greater charge. Officers will be protected from retaliation if they intervene. What are you guys' thoughts on failure to intervene? I think a lot of this comes from the police officers that were standing around when George Floyd was killed, trying to address that issue.
Listen, for most of the use of force policies, and these should all be online somewhere. Like if you check Castle Rock, I'll bet you they have theirs online. I know Douglas County's is. This has been part of their training from the beginning. They train their law enforcement officers to intervene when they see someone breaking law, even one of their own or an officer from another agency. So to the extent that this is a codification of reality, I'm okay with that. I think we could have gone one step farther and created some type of immunity for an intervening officer. I worry about pitting these guys against each other and putting them in a position where a good guy ends up having to be drugged through court by a less than good guy. So creating an immunity so people felt absolutely free to intervene, I think that would have been helpful.
I tend to agree. And what I heard from all the law enforcement is they were supportive of this. They want to feel like all police officers have the ability to intervene and shouldn't be pressured by other police officers not to intervene. And that was just generally the consensus among all of them. And even what George is saying sounds like a lot of sense, that if you did intervene and then someone ends up getting injured, and you want that person going after, the person who was injured, and it just puts them in another really bad spot. But the consensus was on this one that it was good policy, and it was really, like George was saying, a codification of what all the departments are doing.
Right. It is a hard job. I've listened to police officers talk about how demanding this job can be, and sometimes you need somebody to step in and just say, take a break, take a walk, back off, take that minute to calm down a little bit. And I think that, like you mentioned, police officers are already trained for the most part to do this and to help each other, and we need to encourage that more. Fired cops in a database. I thought this was a good aspect of the bill. That by January of 2022, there will be a database and maintain a public database of officers who have been decertified, fired, or found to be untruthful or repeatedly failed to follow training requirements. This seems to me where the union often gets in the way. I'd kind of like to do this for teachers too. If there are bad teachers out there, why do they continue to be passed around? Same thing with bad cops. To me, it sounds like the departments weren't necessarily talking back and forth with each other. What were your thoughts on this aspect of the bill?
I don't think there was a vehicle before this to make this happen. And so I'm glad they've done this. What I'd like to see, if we're going to take it to the next level, if our goal is to try to keep bad apples from bouncing around to other jurisdictions, I'd like to see a nationwide database. I think that's been proposed or talked about, that would keep bad officers from going from California to Colorado. I'd like to see that. I think the only concern that I have is the vehicle to be found to be untruthful. That's got to have some due process protections for that officer. What I don't want to do is see something that's so loosey-goosey that if a chief of police or some other commander takes a personal dislike to an officer, they can put something in place that it's like, that's it, your career is over. So I don't want it to be so easy, but my gosh, once we get there, oh yeah, everybody ought to know about it.
Yep, I agree. And I think, what you're saying, Jeff, about teachers as well, I think kind of the same thing with the qualified immunity. I think this actually gives us a good way step forward that all of us, myself as an elected official and everyone else in their, government immunity just bothers me, right? Government shouldn't be immune either when they harm individuals as well. So I would love to see something like that extended as well.
George, this now allows the state attorney general has the authority to prosecute persistently bad departments and officers. Can you give us a legal analysis on that component of the bill? It seems to be changing who can provide police prosecutions.
Well, the authority that the AG gets out of this bill, and it should come as no surprise, and I would have had this position on this issue had I even won. AG's office is no place to usurp local control over crime and law enforcement. I just don't believe that. And look, with all due respect to the AG, this is a guy that campaigned on the irrelevance of having any knowledge, expertise, or experience in criminal justice to now throw things onto his plate that are so uniquely and specifically criminal justice related. Seems like we're asking the podiatrist to do brain surgery. I'm not sure anybody wants to be that patient. I do think that there's a role to play because the AG's office oversees the post board. And so that matters. And I could see them wanting to expand his authority there. Originally, the bill that was initially drafted, although not dropped, had the AG's office getting jurisdiction over every officer involved shooting. I'm here to tell you that in light of the Elijah McClain incident, I predict that next legislative cycle, they're going to do just that. They're going to take every single officer use of force allegation and send it to the AG's office and take it away from district attorneys. I think that's a horrible move for a state that prides itself on local control and trying to depoliticize criminal justice decisions, but that's where we're at. Anything that we do that increases the footprint of the Attorney General into other areas of criminal justice, I'm opposed to. I mean, look, if I make a mistake as DA, if I make a decision on a case that people don't like, those voters have recourse. What in the world is someone in Durango going to do to the Denver Attorney General or the Boulder Attorney General or governor? What recourse can they possibly have? I just think it's so much of a disconnect between local representation and accountability. It's going to politicize, in my opinion, most of these things.
On that note, George, I do want to talk about Elijah McClain. Dave Young chooses not to prosecute. Seems there is a lot of questions over that issue. You have police officers just today or yesterday apparently taking pictures in the same spot where Elijah McClain died, taking inappropriate pictures there. What do you do when the DA doesn't step up like that and seems not to be really looking at the case well?
Well, I'll take a little issue with the premise, and then we'll get to what can you do. I read that 7-page letter. I didn't just read and when I say 7-page letter, Dave investigated and wrote a letter declining to file charges on a case that he wasn't mandated to do that on. I mean, we're only mandated to do it on officer-involved shootings. This didn't even involve the use of a firearm, but he did it anyway, and I appreciate that. But you got to read this letter. It's on their website at the DA 17, whatever it is. Read it, because you don't come away saying, hey, I think the cops did nothing wrong. What you come away with is, okay, we're missing something here, right? Like when the forensic pathologist says, I can't tell you why he died. I can give you some reasons that might be everything from he had a narrow coronary artery and all the physical exertion caused him to have this. It may have had something to do with the ketamine. I can't really tell you that. When you have those kinds of things going on and you're the DA, and I'm in no way am I telling you I have access to more information than the letter, I don't, but I'm sitting there saying, how do I go to a jury and say, you can find these officers responsible for his death beyond a reasonable doubt, even though the trained forensic pathologist can't do that? You should hold them accountable. Buddy, that's unethical in my opinion to do it. And so what we've created now is this environment where, and you know it's hyper political. This isn't about the truth or justice anymore, because this letter has been on the internet since November. Protests, although much smaller, have been taking place since October of last year. But in the light of the horrible murder of George Floyd and everything that's come after, all of a sudden 2.5 million people on change.org gets the governor's attention, and he says, well, this is a matter of supreme state interest and we must get to the truth. It's like, where were you in November, my man? How about December, January, all the months before the COVID? Where were you? And so now, once again, we have ripped this away from local prosecution, and we have appointed the guy who said criminal justice is irrelevant to the AG's job. What is that guy? What are our expectations for what he's going to do? Do you think that guy is months from now going to stand up in front of the public and say, I agree with Dave Young? No, because he doesn't want another 2.5 million change.org petitioners against him either. My concern is we're now politicizing the heck out of something that should really be looked at in a different kind of way. If we can't prove that these cops engaged in criminal behavior, then what's the next step? I mean, maybe there's an internal affairs breakdown. Maybe we ought to have, by practice and then ultimately by law, a law that says, hey, you know what? No agency can investigate itself when there's the death of a citizen or serious bodily injury of a citizen. I'd be supportive of that, because Aurora investigated itself on this case. That's not good. That's not good optics. And even if it was the best investigation in the world and they had a heck of a detective that did it, people are going to go, you're investigating your own dudes? I don't believe you. So let's fix that piece of it. Let's look at whatever civil liability is there. But the bigger question we ask is, what can you do when the DA drops the ball? Already on our books is a law that says you can go to the court and say, Judge, I think the decision that Dave Young made was arbitrary and capricious, and I want you to order him to prosecute this case and file charges, and maybe even appoint another prosecutor. They didn't pursue that, even though the judge would be the most likely independent voice to look at this, because they know at the end of the day, that judge is going to say, this isn't arbitrary or capricious, even if I disagree with it. It's based on something reasonable. And so they put political pressure on the governor. And you should know this. This ain't never happened in the history of the state of Colorado. No governor has ever come in after a DA has made a decision about whether criminality exists or not and ripped the case away to give to the attorney general. They've appointed the attorney general at the front end of cases, but never at this point in the proceedings. And it's hyper political. And I think Elijah McClain deserved better than that. And frankly, I think the community deserves better than that too.
I guess one of the challenges I have watching all this is wondering why it requires such a movement of people oftentimes to bring prosecution to some of these cases. You did a good job explaining the Elijah McClain incident and the challenges that are around that case, but it feels like a lot of these cases require serious protests, sometimes to drive interest in order to get the attention or the result that people are looking for. And I think there's kind of a movement among people that are seeking that. Are there changes that need to be made to our criminal justice system, George, to where it doesn't require months and months and months of protests before something's brought back up in order for it to be prosecuted sufficiently?
No, I don't think, not in that area. We've talked about some changes I'd support, but not in that area. In fact, what I think we ought to be is very, very concerned about the impact that the mob can have on a prosecutor who is politically minded instead of justice minded. I mean, Dave Young's been beaten to death on every interview he's had, whether it's with super conservative Cuomo or any NPR, whatever. I mean, he's been beaten to death in the public. But if all of a sudden it just takes 2.5 million people to gin up a prosecution, and by the way, 2.5 million people who aren't in the state of Colorado, just all over the world on change.org. If you can get enough media attention, you can force the DA to bring a prosecution. Be scared, be worried. You want a prosecutor who can stand up in the face of those windstorms and say, I don't believe it's justice to move forward. Or the opposite, and that is to move forward even when everybody pushes back against him. Imagine a circumstance where Dave Young says, I think what these cops did is wrong. I think it's also a violation of the law, and I'm going to prosecute them. And the body cam gets out, other things get out, and people go, this is outrageous. Those cops did nothing wrong. And they get 2.5 million people from change.org to say, you should dismiss the case. If a DA responded to that and dismissed it, we'd say, you gutless weasel. You are political. You are not a justice seeker. Same approach here in my mind. Now, having said that, I do want the public to continue to stay engaged in how we define justice and how we move forward. But there's a trend here, and I've even heard this brought up in some of the community discussions, where there's proposals out there that say, well, we should vote on whether or not there should be charges. What? That we do have voting. It's called the jury. And in the state of Colorado, we entrust the DAs to make the decision at the front end, or maybe we're going to order us to grand jury every single charge. I don't know. But I think the flaw in the system is to accept the idea that if enough people say someone should be prosecuted, then by God, they should be prosecuted. That just isn't ethical.
Great. Thank you, George. I can see why you're a good constitutional professor. Patrick, want to talk about this protester protection aspect of the bill. Tucker Carlson brought this up, and I am sympathetic to his position. It feels like there's two different Americas sometimes, where we have in this bill all these rules that the police have got to follow when it comes to protesters. We can't shoot rubber bullets indiscriminately. You cannot target rubber bullet shots to someone's head, torso, or back. At that point, I'm not sure where you shoot a rubber bullet. Maybe, I guess, their hands. It prevents officers from using tear gas before announcing it and giving time for people to disperse. So you get all these rules that police have got to follow. Meanwhile, people are just spray painting and tearing down statues and doing whatever they want to buildings of small businesses, breaking them down. and yet you've got a step-by-step rule that police have got to follow. It feels oftentimes like we have two different Americas. Do you want to comment on the police protection aspect of this bill?
Yeah, so on that aspect, I mean, I think you ask everyone, should police just be able to go out and start shooting tear gas into the middle of a crowd? And everyone would say no. And guess what? They're not doing it. I mean, even in Colorado with the protests that we saw, they were given very sufficient warning over loudspeakers before all this started happening. So might be another case of codifying a lot of the procedures that are already in place. What I think we got to take a look at is, at least bothers me most in Colorado, is why weren't they actually engaging and arresting those individuals once the vandalism and everything started? And I don't know why that didn't happen in many cases. I could see in some cases where the officers chose not to because actually put the risk of their own officers at greater risk. So they tried to stay back. But I think there's some other circumstances where we've seen it because of political motivation, kind of like George was saying with prosecution, that we shouldn't allow a vote on this, but there was a lot of political pressure on them not to engage in people spray painting and knocking down statues. And that's what bothers me. And then we even have this example we've set in Denver very specifically. We had some protesters who interrupted the governor's State of the State speech because he wasn't liberal enough for them. And they actually got drug out. And guess what happened? Democrats went to the House floor and demanded that those people not be prosecuted. And what did the liberal Denver DA do? They chose not to prosecute them. Same thing we're seeing now with a lot of these people that were arrested for vandalism and other different things and violating curfews were arrested in the city of Denver. What they do? They've dropped a lot of the charges through all of them. And so, I've seen some disturbing aspects of, they like to criticize Dave Young for not prosecuting, but then on the other hand, we see when Beth McCann, a liberal DA, doesn't prosecute people for committing a crime, they're cheering that. And it's rather disturbing. And I would like to see some of those people prosecuted, because if we did actually prosecute them, then we'd actually see an end to this. But when they saw Denver have an estimate of 1 million, I'm telling you, that's not even close. There's been well over $1 million of damage just to the Capitol alone. I think there were 6 patrol cars, state patrol only, totally smashed. We're talking, I would say, probably tens of millions of damage when it's all said and done. And, people, when you've got literally people throwing Molotov cocktails at officers and in buildings, and then we're not actually prosecuting that's a big, big problem.
Yeah, if you haven't been down to downtown Denver, it looks like a third world war zone these days. Within 3-block radius of just about everywhere around the Capitol, you've broken windows, spray painted. It's reckless and lawless. We've got just really about 5-6 more minutes, and I'd like to hear from both of you on this. George, I'll start with you. You've kind of predicted things that are going to happen as a result of COVID-19. We were going to see a crime wave. We're seeing that happen. What is going to happen to policing in our state as a result of the movements that are taking place right now?
Like I'd said earlier, I really do think we're going to see an Atlas Shrugged moment here with law enforcement, where you're going to see a lot of good veteran officers hang it up and say, I don't need this anymore. I'm going to retire and figure out something else to do. And I think you're going to see a lot of good young people, maybe a generation's worth, say, why in the world would I get involved in law enforcement? And I'll give you a personal example. In 8 years as DA, I have spent considerable time trying to recruit more applicants from underrepresented communities, people of color, African Americans, Latino, it doesn't matter. I want them to compete in that applicant pool because, one, I think it gives us a better shot at getting better people, but it allows us to consider things that are part of someone's background that someone else may not have. And of the African American prosecutors I have in my office, and I think, by the way, statewide, we have at every level of government, municipal, state, and federal, I think we have 15. That's shocking. But of the ones I have in my office, each one has come to me separately to tell stories of how, look, when they go home and they see their family isn't proud of them for what they do. Their family's like, how can you go work for the man? How can you go work for prosecutors? Shouldn't you be working for the defense? And as long as there's that attitude, and by the way, it spreads now across the community, you're going to get a lower quality applicant for law enforcement. And that's not what we should be striving for. We don't throw money at these men and women. We don't give them an easy cush job. We demand a lot from them. And then to make laws like this, which have such an initial negative connotation to them, negative intent, and you see the stuff on the news and you hear people talk about the 1% of the 1%. I mean, how many cops do you think right now are cursing the guy from Minneapolis because of what he has done to their profession, even more than already existed? I mean, it's very, very tough. I worry about the future. And when you talk about the surge in crime, I'll just give you a couple numbers. I don't think I've talked about these publicly yet. Over this period of time last year out of Aurora, we had 4 homicides, 4 in our jurisdiction. As of this time this year, we're up around 20. That is about a 500% increase in just that one. We haven't calculated the rest for ag, rob, sex, assault, burglary, but you combine that at the top end with things like motor vehicle theft, which has surged since the governor's stay-at-home order. I'm telling you, there is a lawlessness out there that is more and more pervasive. We've got the cops on their heels. All we hear about is it's okay, the spray paint and the glass and the damage, because that's property and we're talking about people. And they're super angry, so let's just let it go. That is only going to make the rest of this year and next year suck even more for public safety.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, one of the things too that I think is bugging the law enforcement the most, that's making them really second guess their career, and this is based on a lot of my personal conversations. It's just an example that we know well, Jeff, given what you do, that a lot of times culture can be a larger change than even things that are written in statute. And so for them, it's just really the negative connotations of how they're being covered and the way that they're painting all of them with a bad brush, that they're bad people. And, you know, I take a look back at even my own service in the military. When I came back to a hero's welcome. I'm sure George did too, where the police were out there saluting us and firefighters were spraying us. But then I look back at the people that were organizing that hero's welcome home, and it was the folks from Vietnam who didn't get that same welcome home. They were treated poorly. They were treated a lot of the ways that a lot of the police officers are being treated now. And it's really incredibly unfortunate. So I think we've got to do at least our part, that when we see a police officer, to be thankful, to respect them. If we have a chance to be on, you know, a megaphone, or, you know, using my position as an elected official to talk good about law enforcement, we should be doing that as much as we possibly can. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to do to help them out. One of my concerns is we're seeing this rise in crime, like George was talking about. And then we also see the Democrats wanting to take away everyone's ability to protect themselves from violent crime. So they want to do things like make it harder to access your personal protection weapon when you're sleeping at night, or maybe even take it away from you entirely. So we're seeing a lot of concerning things. Like, you know, the example of, it was kind of strange. I wish I could go out and teach them tactics and procedures. But if you look at that couple in St. Louis, I mean, that was concerning. What was happening to their property? I would probably, you know, given them much better tactics and training, and would have handled it a little differently myself. But that's an example where a lot of folks just want to take that away completely. And then what do you let happen? A mob just storms your house, and you've just got to let it happen, like George was saying, because they're really angry. So let's make it okay. That's not okay. And so we need to also make sure, is because we're going to be facing bigger budget crises and budget crunches. So we need to make sure we're not, you know, basically balancing our government budgets on the backs of our law enforcement. But there are going to eventually be some cuts eventually. So we need to make sure that we're doing whatever we can to give citizens the ability to protect themselves as well.
I'm assuming that both of you are opposed to defunding the police.
Yes, very opposed.
Well, let me say this though, and I think Patrick would be here too. If we could get to a place where we needed less police, where we could address some of these other systemic issues and societal issues that actually lead to the crime, because cops don't create crime, right? If we could get there, yeah, I'd be all in favor of saying, hey, how can we reduce how much we spend on these things? But at the onset of a crime wave that I think is coming, that we've already started to see, to say, now's the time we need to beat our swords into plowshares, I think it's premature. I think we're setting ourselves up for a super bad year.
Yeah,
Well,
I tend to agree. I think we're going to be very similar to what was it, 93 when we had the summer of violence. I see that kind of same pattern happening. And then what they're doing with even the prison budgets, trying to, oh, we got to reduce our prison budgets now and get rid of private prisons. They're actually more affordable. And so we're going to see this, happening all over again. It's a cycle that's repeating itself.
We've got to jump here. We could keep talking. Thank you, gentlemen, first of all, for your leadership in this community. You didn't need to run for office. You did. You're making a difference. You're taking the arrows right on the front. And I really appreciate the work that you do for our community. And just want to let you know we're very, very grateful for you. As we wrap here, I think what I heard today, let me just summarize it up. Where there are bad cops, where there is racism, where there is bigotry and prejudice and harm inflicted by law enforcement, we got to root it out. It's bad. It's not the way America's set up. And we need to have systems in place to identify it, make sure that these cops aren't moved from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and that we can keep people safe from these people. At the same time, a lot of what's in this bill is already practiced by most law enforcement communities. And this kind of codifies it, but a lot of law enforcement stepped up and said, we're fine with the body cameras. We're fine with banning certain practices. We don't want bad cops moving from department to department either. We're okay with some of this. But we need to make sure that justice is done in these cases, and we can't rely upon politics or mobs to become the prosecutor, the jury, the judge, and everything, and the executioner are all in between, where these people are going to be drugged through a process that's not really about the law, it's about politics. And so we need to be careful about that as well. And then finally, what our police officers do for our community is very, very important. And we need to be in support of them. We need to honor them. We need to be respectful to them. And for those of you that are watching that are members of the law enforcement, I want you to know we pray for you every Sunday. And we support the work that you do, and we're grateful for you. And we need to back the blue when we can and support them for the good work they do in our communities. Any comments on that? Did I get it right?
You did. You did.
All right.
I agree. And thanks for having us on, Jeff. We appreciate
you.
everything that you guys do and Centennial Institute does.
Great conversation. Good conversation.
Great. Well, thank you all. We're going to continue to host events like this in the future, so be sure to check out our website. These things pop up quick because we like to be commenting about what's in the news. But thank you, Patrick. Thank you, George, for everything that you do. Thanks to everybody that watched, and be sure to tune in next time. If you're looking for that degree, make sure you check out CCU. We'd love to have you. All right. God bless you all. Thanks.